Imagine you are an elephant. You weigh 6 tons. You have survived lions, droughts, and poachers. You are the most powerful land animal on Earth. And right now, a tree is stopping you from eating its leaves. Not with thorns, not with poison, with an army of tiny insects that just crawled into your nose. That really happens every single day in East Africa. And the tree responsible does not have venom, does not have armor, and cannot run. It figured out something more powerful than any of those things. It built a military alliance with one of the most aggressive creatures in the insect world. And in exchange for their loyalty, the tree pays them rent, feeds them every single day, and gives them apartments inside its own body. This is not science fiction. This is not a metaphor. This is the Whistling Thorn, and once you understand what this tree actually does, you will never look at a plant the same way again. Here is what makes this story so bizarre right from the start. Most trees protect themselves with chemistry. They pump bitter toxins into their leaves. They produce tannins that taste like chewing on a rock. They manufacture poisons that mess with the nervous systems of anything that tries to eat them. The Whistling Thorn does none of that. It evolved without a single chemical weapon. It is on its own, completely and utterly defenseless. No toxins, no armor, nothing. And yet it survives in one of the most dangerous feeding zones on the planet, surrounded by giraffes, elephants, buffalo, and zebras, all of which would love nothing more than a free meal. So how does a totally defenseless tree survive for thousands of years in the middle of Africa's most hungry ecosystem? The answer is inside those strange hollow thorns. And it gets so much stranger than you think. This is Professor Leaf, and today we are going deep into one of the most mind-blowing plant partnerships ever discovered by science. We are talking about a tree that literally whistles in the wind, a tree that hosts 4 competing ant armies at the same time, a tree whose survival depends entirely on the loyalty of insects that could abandon it at any moment. And we are going to reveal what happens when scientists actually removed those ants from the equation, because the results were so dramatic they changed the way researchers understand how ecosystems hold together. Stay with me, because the next 11 minutes are going to completely rewire how you think about trees, ants, and the invisible wars happening right now in the African grasslands. Let's scene start at the beginning, and the beginning of this story is a place. The Whistling Thorn, known to scientists as Vachellia drepanolobium, grows exclusively in East Africa. It is not found naturally anywhere else on the planet, but within East Africa, it does something extraordinary. It dominates. On the heavy black cotton clay soils that cover vast stretches of Kenya and Tanzania, soils so dense and waterlogged in the wet season, and so cracked and brutal in the dry season that most trees simply give up, the Whistling Thorn thrives. And it does not just survive there, it takes over. Entire forests stretching for miles made up almost entirely of this one species. Botanists call it a near monoculture, which is a fancy way of saying one tree just beat every other tree so badly in the competition for space that it gets to be the only one around. Drive through the Masai Mara, walk through parts of the Serengeti, and you will see these trees everywhere. This is the most common tree in some of the most famous wildlife reserves on Earth, and until recently, most tourists drove right past them without a second glance. But if you stopped and looked closely, you would notice something immediately. These trees sound different. When the wind blows through the branches, there is a haunting, low whistle, not the rustle of leaves. An actual whistling sound, almost musical, almost eerie, like the tree is breathing. That sound comes from the hollow thorn bulbs. The swollen base of each paired thorn is naturally hollow, a biological structure scientists call a domatium, which is essentially a pre-built apartment. The ants that live in these trees bore tiny entrance holes into each bulb, and when the wind blows through those holes at just the right angle, the air vibrates and the tree whistles. Every tree in that forest is home to thousands of ants. Every ant colony is living inside the body of the tree itself, and that whistling sound you hear on the breeze is essentially the tree singing with its own army. But here's what nobody tells you about this arrangement. It is not peaceful. It is a war. 4 different ant species compete to live in the Whistling Thorn. 4 separate armies. 4 distinct species with completely different strategies, different aggression levels, different ways of rewarding or exploiting the tree. And these 4 species do not share. They fight constantly for control of individual trees, and whichever species wins gets full occupancy rights. The most common winner, a species called Chromatogaster mimosae, occupies approximately half of all Whistling Thorn trees across East Africa. It is ferociously aggressive, it defends its tree with everything it has, and it is the species most likely to crawl into your nose if you get too close. But the other 3 species have their own remarkable tricks. Some are better fighters, some are more likely to betray the tree that feeds them, and one species does something so unexpected that when scientists first observed it, they thought they were seeing a mistake. But before we get to the betrayal, let's see and understand what the tree is actually offering, because this is where the genius of the whole system becomes clear. The Whistling Thorn makes 2 kinds of payment to its ant tenants. First, it provides housing. Those swollen, hollow thorn bulbs are not accidental. They are purpose-built ant apartments, evolved specifically to give the ants a safe, dry, protected place to raise their larvae, store their food, and shelter their queens. A mature whistling thorn can have hundreds of these bulbs across its branches, each one potentially housing part of a colony that numbers in the thousands. Second, the tree pays in food. At the base of its leaves, the whistling thorn produces extrafloral nectaries, tiny glands that secrete sweet, sugary nectar directly onto the plant's surface. The ants lap up this nectar like it is a permanent all-you-can-eat buffet. one that refreshes itself every single day as long as the tree is alive and healthy. The tree does not just hire these ants. It keeps them fed, keeps them housed, and keeps them loyal through consistent, reliable payment that never stops as long as the partnership holds. And in return, the ants go to war on behalf of the tree. When a giraffe extends its incredible neck and wraps its long dark tongue around a branch, the vibration sends a chemical alarm signal through the colony in seconds. The alarm pheromones, specifically compounds called 3-octanone and 3-octanol, act like a military alert system, mobilizing every worker ant in the immediate area into an immediate defensive swarm. Ants flood out of the hollow bulbs by the hundreds. They run directly toward the source of the disturbance. They climb onto the giraffe's tongue, into its nostrils, around its eyes. They sting, and a giraffe, which can fight off lions with its hooves and swing its neck like a club, will back away from a tree full of ants. But the most dramatic test of this partnership is not the giraffe. It is what happens when something much bigger shows up. An African elephant weighs up to 6 tons and eats up to 300 pounds of vegetation every single day. It uses its trunk to grab branches and strip them bare. Its thick skin barely registers thorns, and the savanna it lives in is full of trees it has learned to eat without fear. But the whistling thorn is different. When an elephant reaches toward a branch, the ant response is instantaneous. Tons of ants swarm into the one place where the elephant has no armor whatsoever, the inside of its trunk. The trunk of an elephant is one of the most sensitive organs in the animal kingdom. It contains more muscle fibers than any other structure in the animal world, and its internal lining is extremely sensitive to pain. When ants begin stinging the inside of an elephant's trunk, the elephant pulls back. It has to. Even an animal that can uproot entire trees with its body weight cannot ignore thousands of simultaneous stings in its most sensitive organ. Researchers studying elephant feeding behavior in Kenya found that elephants consistently avoid heavily ant-colonized whistling thorn trees, choosing instead to feed on trees with fewer or weaker ant colonies. A 6-ton animal is being redirected by creatures that individually weigh less than a grain of rice. Now, if you have been watching this and thinking this is one of the greatest stories you have heard in a while, you are absolutely right, and you deserve to see a lot more of them. Right here on Professor Leaf, we explore the most mind-blowing plants and natural systems on Earth, stories that most people never hear, relationships that science is still working to fully understand. If you have not already, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. And if this video is making your brain light up the way it is lighting up mine, go ahead and drop a like. It takes 1 second and it helps more people find these stories. Alright, because now we are about to get into the part where things get genuinely dark. Let's Scene ask a simple question. What happens if the whistling thorn disappears? Not a dramatic meteor strike, not a disease. Just imagine that over the next decade, this tree quietly vanishes from East Africa's black cotton soils. What actually falls apart? The answer is a cascade of failures so interconnected that it is almost impossible to fully trace where one ending stops and the next one begins. Within the first weeks, the most immediate effect would be felt by the 4 ant species themselves. Each of these species is deeply specialized for life inside the whistling thorn. The hollow thorn bulbs are not just convenient, they are the primary nesting site for these ants in many parts of their range. Without the tree, there is no housing, no nectar, no colony infrastructure. The populations would collapse rapidly, and these ant species do not just matter to the tree. They are predators of other insects across the forest floor. Remove them, and the insects they were eating explode in population. Caterpillars, grasshoppers, beetles, the leaf-eating insects that were being held in check by the ant colonies suddenly have no predators. The savanna grassland begins to change. Within months, the larger animals that depended on the whistling thorn begin to feel the pressure. Over 20 species of bird have been documented nesting in these trees. The thorny structure and the constant ant presence makes these trees some of the safest nesting sites in the savanna because predators avoid the ants too. No tree, no safe nesting site. Bird populations begin to concentrate elsewhere, overcrowding other habitat, reducing breeding success. The birds that eat the insects lose their feeding grounds. The predators that eat the birds lose their prey base, and spreading outward through the food web, the first tremors of a genuine ecological unraveling begin to be felt. Long term, the loss of these trees from the black cotton soils would fundamentally change the landscape itself. These soils are difficult for most trees to colonize. The whistling thorn did not just grow there. It stabilized those soils, shading them, dropping leaf litter that fed the microbial communities below, and its root systems breaking up the clay and creating channels for water movement. Without it, the black cotton soils revert to their natural state, cracked, hard, waterlogged in the wet season, concrete-like in the dry season, and largely inhospitable to most plant life. Grassland takes over where woodland stood. The animals that depended on woodland shade, on the particular insect communities of the woodland, on the specific food sources only this tree provided, they begin to retreat, and some of them have nowhere to go. Now, here is where the science catches up with the story, because what we just described is not just theory. It was accidentally tested in real life, and what scientists discovered in that experiment shook the ecological world. For over a decade, researchers at the Mpala Research Center in Kenya conducted one of the most important long-term ecological experiments ever run on a plant-animal relationship. They set up large fenced enclosures on the Kenyan savanna that excluded different types of large herbivores, and they watched what happened to the whistling thorn and its ant partners under different conditions. The results were extraordinary. When large herbivores like elephants and giraffes were present, The trees invested heavily in their ant partners. They produced more nectar, maintained more hollow thorn domatia, and kept their ant colonies well-fed and loyal. The ants in turn defended the trees with maximum aggression. The system worked exactly as the mutualism should, but here is what does not make any sense at first glance. When large herbivores were excluded and the trees no longer needed their ant defense as urgently, the trees started to reduce their investment in the partnership. Less nectar, fewer thorn apartments maintained. The trees essentially started firing their bodyguards because they did not think they needed them anymore, and then something happened that scientists did not expect. The African elephant population in the area shifted. A drought changed feeding patterns. Large herbivores began returning to areas the trees thought were safe, and the trees that had reduced their ant populations were suddenly defenseless. They were eaten heavily. Some died. The trees that had maintained their ant partnerships even when it seemed unnecessary survived in far greater numbers. But that still was not the biggest discovery. The real revelation came when researchers looked at a species of ant called Chromatogaster nigriceps, one of the 4 competing species that lives in the Whistling Thorn. This ant does something the others do not. When it takes over a tree, it clips the growing buds of surrounding vegetation, preventing any other plant from growing close enough to form branch connections with its whistling thorn. Scientists initially thought this was territorial behavior, just the ants being aggressive about their space, but it turned out to be something far more calculated. The ants were preventing other trees from growing close enough to form highways that other ant species could use to invade their tree. The nigriceps ants were actively managing the landscape around their host tree to prevent rival colonies from moving in. They were not just defending the tree, they were doing urban planning. And then the story gets one final twist that brings us all the way back to that opening image of the elephant backing away from a tiny tree. Scientists recently confirmed something that had been suspected for years. The effectiveness of the Whistling Thorn's ant defense is not uniform. It varies dramatically based on which of the 4 ant species is living in any given tree. The species called Chromatogaster mimosae, the one that occupies about half of all trees, is the most aggressive defender. Trees occupied by mimosae have significantly lower levels of herbivore damage than trees occupied by other species. But trees occupied by the species called Tetraponera penzigi, a relatively docile ant that lives in the same hollow bulbs, are eaten far more heavily. And here's the extraordinary part. The tree has no choice in who moves in. It cannot select its tenant. It builds the apartments, it produces the food, and then it waits to see which army shows up first. The survival of a tree that can live for decades comes down to a lottery. Whatever ant species colonizes it first will determine whether that tree gets to stand for 20 years or gets stripped to its bark by a hungry giraffe next Tuesday. And that brings us to the final mind-blowing layer of this story. Scientists studying the Whistling Thorn discovered that when the ant colonies are under stress, when their food supply drops, when the tree is struggling, some ant species actually begin to farm the tree instead of protecting it. They start damaging the bark to access internal sap. They allow small-scale, phloem-feeding insects called insects to colonize the tree, then harvest the honeydew those insects produce. In other words, when the deal breaks down, the ants stop being bodyguards and start being parasites. The tree that built its entire survival strategy on loyalty finds out that loyalty in nature is always conditional. The ants will protect the tree as long as it keeps paying. The moment the payment stops, the army switches sides. And somehow, despite that terrifying vulnerability, this tree has survived for thousands of years across thousands of square miles of the most competitive ecosystem on Earth. This is either the most reckless survival strategy in the plant kingdom, or it is the most brilliant one. And honestly, I think it might be both. So here's the question I want you to answer in the comments below. If you were the Whistling Thorn and you had to pick one of 4 ant species to protect you, knowing that some species are fierce defenders, some are unreliable, and one will eventually start farming you instead of protecting you, which gamble would you take? And do you think the tree is getting a fair deal, or are the ants really the ones running this whole operation? Drop your answer below because I read every single comment on this channel and I genuinely want to know what you think. And if this story made your jaw drop the way it should have, share it with someone in your life who loves nature or animals or science, because there are people who need to know that a tree is out here running a protection racket with 4 competing ant gangs in the middle of Kenya, and they deserve to find out. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. Every single video on this channel is a doorway into a part of the natural world that most people walk right past, and you choosing to walk through that door means everything. In our next video, we are going to look at a plant that does not just defend itself from animals, it traps them, digests them, and uses their bodies as fertilizer. And the size of what it can catch will genuinely surprise you. You do not want to miss it. Until then, stay curious, stay wild, and remember, every leaf has a story. This is Professor Leaf. See you in the next one.